Welcome back, gang. In this tutorial, I'll give you several very specific tips for making your writing more concise by avoiding wordy citations. Obviously, the most efficient citation is an endnote or a footnote or a parenthetical citation at the end of a sentence. This tutorial assumes that you've decided to use a narrative citation. The sentences I'll be revising are invented, but they are very similar to sentences that my students often write. My examples use the APA style of citation, but the lesson applies just as well to other styles. Here's the first example. According to Leslie Simmons in her article, The Social Media Trap, it is natural for people to measure themselves against their peers. I'll start by saying that this is not a bad sentence. If we remove the date, it could easily appear in an article written for a newspaper or a magazine. You'll occasionally see sentences like this in academic writing, but they are unusual. You could select 100 journal articles at random and not find a single sentence like this in any of them. The first thing I notice is the author's first name. So let me say a few things about that. Of course, we commonly refer to authors' first names when we're discussing the work of famous people like Karl Marx or Emily Dickinson. That's also true when we cite the academic work of major scholars in an academic discipline. We don't have to use the first name then, but it is common. Things get slightly more complicated when we're citing a typical journal article written by a typical scholar. In most academic disciplines, especially in the social and physical sciences, we do not usually refer to the author's first name. There are a few disciplines where introducing an author by their first and last names is somewhat common, so you might want to check. But as I said, in most disciplines, it's really not the norm. In the case of this student's paper, the topic falls under the social sciences, so let's remove the first name. The next thing I notice is the title of the article. Again, if we're writing about a famous work like Hamlet or Das Kapital, we would naturally refer to its title. But if we're citing a typical journal article written by a typical scholar, we do not refer to the title in a citation. We save that information for the references section. So let's say goodbye to that. Can you guess what we need to cut next? Think about this phrase, in her article. Is the information useful? Does it tell readers anything they can't guess for themselves? Is it really relevant that we're citing an article rather than a book? Any reader who needs to know such information can use the references section to track it down. So let's remove that phrase. The result of all this editing is a lot of big holes. Let's rearrange the pieces and read it again. According to Simmons, it is natural for people to measure themselves against their peers. That sounds much more academic, and it's far more concise. The original contained 23 words, now we're down to 15. That's a 35% difference. Our next example contains a few similar problems and 2 new ones. Try to identify them before I do. Are you ready? By the author D.F. Johnson, a consequence was concluded that social media can distract people from their daily lives. Unlike the first example, this sentence would not sound good in any context. The basic structure is not natural English, but we can work with it. Let's start with the easy stuff. Did you notice the author's initials? Everything that I said a few moments ago about using an author's first name applies as well to an author's initials. The APA system provides one exception. If your paper cites 2 authors with the same last name, you should include the first initial in the citation to help your readers see the difference. That's not the case in this paper, so let's delete the initials. Now notice this phrase, the author. We can use this phrase after the first citation if we want to let the reader know that we're summarizing information from the same source. Doing so lets us add some variation to our sentences. But it's pointless to name the source and refer to them as the author in the same sentence. Every source has an author, so the reader doesn't need to be told that. So let's remove that phrase. The next problem is more conceptual. Look at the word consequence. Now look at this clause that makes up most of the sentence. Do you see what I'm worried about? The underlined clause is the consequence. If we can avoid two references to the same thing, let's do it. So let's say goodbye to a consequence. If we fool around with the rest of the sentence and decide we really need it, we can always bring it back. Once again, we're left with some holes, but the grammar is a little clunky, so we're going to have to make a few more changes if we want the sentence to sound right. My eye is drawn to the phrase was concluded. It's a verb in the passive voice. Its subject used to be a consequence, but we deleted that, so now the verb has no subject. Maybe deleting a consequence was a mistake after all? I don't think so. It is possible to write a citation in the passive voice, but doing so is not common with the verb conclude. So let's make it active. Conclude is a regular verb, so making the change is easy. The simple past tense and the past participle, which you might call the third form, are identical. All we have to do is delete the word was, and poof, the verb is active. And using an active verb makes sense here, right? Because Johnson is the person who's concluding something. The only problem we have left is the word by at the beginning of the sentence. It was originally used because the verb was passive, but that's also what made the sentence sound so strange. In English, the by phrase normally follows a passive verb. It doesn't come first. Fortunately, now that we've made the verb active, we don't need a by phrase. So let's just delete it. Now we have something that looks like it might work. We'll clean it up. Johnson concluded that social media can distract people from their daily lives. Again, that sounds very academic, and the sentence is 38% lighter, with no loss of meaning. If you're not sure about that, if you think I might have removed too much, please pause the video and look at the original. I don't think you'll find anything missing. My last example is longer than the others. I've chosen it because it illustrates a common problem that leads to a lot of wordiness. There are also a couple of smaller problems that you should now be able to notice quickly. Let's take a look. Scholars from Italy, headed by Umberto Brizzi, carried out research dedicated to finding a connection between the use of social media in education and students' academic progress. In their research paper, they have shown that social media can positively affect students' academic performance. The first thing I notice is that the passage uses 7 words to name the authors. That's a lot. As with our first example, I can imagine a citation like this in a newspaper or a magazine article, but it's not very academic. I hope one of the first things that you noticed was the lead author's first name. Again, it's not wrong, but it's very unusual, especially in the social and physical sciences. So let's remove Umberto. Next, I see the reference to the fact that the scholars are Italian. I can easily imagine many situations in which the nationality of the people being studied is relevant, but the nationality of the scholars themselves is usually not relevant. By itself, being Italian shouldn't make someone's research any better or any worse. The exceptions are so unusual that I won't even mention them. So let's remove that reference. Now we're left with the idea that the scholars are headed by Brizzi. Most systems of documentation give us an efficient way of communicating that fact. In the APA style, we'll shorten all of it to Brizzi et al. Now that we've done that, you've probably noticed that the date of publication is in the wrong place. So let's put it where it belongs, immediately after the author's name. The next problem that should be pretty obvious is this reference to their research paper. Hypothetically, this is permissible. It makes the transition between sentences smooth, but again, it's the kind of transition you'll see more in journalism than academic writing. When you do see it in academic writing, it's usually because the article is drawing special attention to one paper in particular, maybe a famous paper. If we want to add some variation to a summary, we're more likely to use words like study or results. So let's remove that. Now let's catch our breath and examine what we have left. We've handled the small problems, but I haven't even mentioned the biggest one. If you haven't seen it yet, pause the video for a minute and get a general idea of what the text is about. Remember that a big cause of wordiness is redundancy. Have you seen it? The text we're looking at contains two separate sentences. Let's compare them. There's a reference to social media in the first sentence, and a similar reference in the second. There's a reference to academic progress in the first sentence, and a similar reference in the second. The first sentence refers generally to a connection between those two ideas, and the second actually specifies what the connection is. In short, the two sentences contain a lot of the same information. This is a common pattern that I see in student writing. One sentence introduces an idea generally without making a point about it. The next sentence gets to the point, but it does so by repeating a lot of information that's in the previous sentence. The solution is usually to remove the repetitions and combine what remains into one sentence. In this case, the second sentence says almost everything that's important. The exception is that the reference to the use of social media in education is more specific than the phrase social media in the second sentence. So let's remove all the duplicated information, keeping just the best versions. We'll clean it up. And surprisingly, we don't need to make any other changes. Usually, when you remove that much material, you need to make a few adjustments. But this time we got lucky. I think the result looks good. Brizzi et al. Have shown that the use of social media in education can positively affect students' academic performance. The original was 44 words long. This version is 20 words long. The changes eliminated more than 50% of it, but we've lost no real content. In fact, it's a lot easier now to understand what the writer is trying to communicate. Thanks for watching. Say what you mean.